You have my identification. There is no legal basis for my continued detention. I am going to leave.
You're not going anywhere.
Officer, please, just call your supervisor. There is no need for this.
The polished chrome of the gas pump nozzle clicked, the sound sharp and final in the warm afternoon air. It was precisely 2:15 p.m. on a bright, cloudless Wednesday, a day that felt utterly, deceptively ordinary. Judge Marcus Hayes, a man whose life was defined by order and reason, stood by his dark gray Lincoln sedan, the routine of filling his tank a familiar, mindless comfort. He loosened the knot of his silk tie, the black fabric a stark contrast to his crisp white shirt. The morning had been grueling, spent presiding over a complex corporate fraud case, and he was looking forward to a quiet evening at home with his wife, Sarah. The last thing on his mind was that this mundane stop at a gleaming Shell station, a stop he'd made 100 times before, was about to become the epicenter of a national firestorm. Before we delve into the heart of this explosive story, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city and state in the comments below. And if you believe that justice should be blind to the color of one's skin, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is a chilling reminder of how far we still have to go. At 58 years old, Judge Hayes was the embodiment of judicial temperament. With 20 years on the bench in the county's circuit court, he had earned a reputation for being meticulous, fair, and unshakably calm. Lawyers who argued before him knew better than to come unprepared. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His sharp intellect and profound knowledge of the law were his gavel, commanding respect more effectively than any display of temper. He had built his career brick by brick, from a driven public defender to a sharp-witted prosecutor, and finally to the honored position he now held. He lived in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, was a deacon at his church, and sat on the board of a local youth charity. Nothing about the man courted controversy. That Wednesday had begun like any other. He'd arrived at the courthouse before sunrise, his thermos of black coffee in hand, to review briefs and prepare for the day's proceedings. The fraud case was a labyrinth of shell corporations and deceptive accounting, and he had spent hours ensuring he understood every nuance before taking the bench. By the time he adjourned for the day, he was mentally exhausted but satisfied. He had upheld the law. He had served justice. The gas station was a familiar landmark, nestled conveniently between the downtown courthouse and his peaceful neighborhood. It was clean, well lit, and always busy with the afternoon rush of professionals heading home. He pulled up to pump number 4, the sun warm on his face as he stepped out of his car. He went through the motions without a thought. Credit card swiped, premium unleaded selected, nozzle inserted. It was a sequence of events so mundane, so utterly unremarkable, that it should never have drawn a second glance. But across the asphalt lot, it had. Officer Brian Trent, a 32-year-old with 6 years on the force and a burgeoning reputation for aggressive patrol tactics, sat in his unmarked Ford Explorer. He'd pulled in for a bottle of water, but his attention was snagged by the sight of the Lincoln and the man standing beside it. In Officer Trent's mind, a simple, dangerous calculus began to form. A luxury sedan, a well-dressed black man, a predominantly white, affluent area. According to the statement he would later give, his training and experience told him that something didn't fit. What unfolded next would be captured from 3 different angles by the station's high-definition security cameras, a silent, unblinking witness to a gross abuse of power. The footage would later show Judge Hayes behaving in the most ordinary way imaginable. He waited patiently for the tank to fill, briefly checking his email on his phone. He glanced up at the spinning numbers on the pump, then casually surveyed the other customers around him. A woman wrangling 2 kids into a minivan, a man in a pickup truck cleaning his windshield. There was no nervousness, no furtive glances, nothing that a reasonable person would ever construe as suspicious. But reason had already left the building. Officer Trent got out of his Explorer, his movements sharp and deliberate. He didn't turn on his body camera, a fact that would later become a major point of contention. He strode across the lot, his boots making soft, purposeful sounds on the pavement. He didn't approach from the front or the side. He came up from behind, a classic tactic of intimidation. The first words Judge Hayes heard were not a polite inquiry or an officer identifying himself. They were a sharp, accusatory command. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." Judge Hayes turned, startled. He saw a man in a tactical polo shirt and cargo pants, a badge clipped to his belt and a holstered firearm on his hip. He was young, with a severe, close-cropped haircut and an intense, unwavering stare. "Officer?" Judge Hayes asked, his voice even, though his heart had begun to beat a little faster. "I said, step away from the vehicle. Put your hands on the roof of the car, now!" There was no preamble, no explanation, just a raw, naked command, pregnant with the threat of violence. The gas pump clicked off, the sudden silence of the completed transaction a stark contrast to the escalating tension. At that moment, the quiet, orderly world of Judge Marcus Hayes began to fracture, and a nightmare he thought could never happen to a man of his stature began to unfold in the bright, unforgiving light of a Wednesday afternoon. Confusion warred with a lifetime of ingrained respect for the badge. Judge Hayes, a man who swore in police officers and signed their warrants, was now on the receiving end of a command usually reserved for felons. He remained standing, his hands held slightly out to his sides in a gesture of non-aggression. "Officer, I'm just getting gas," he said, his voice the epitome of calm reason. "Is there a problem?" "The problem is you're not following my commands," Officer Trent snapped back, his voice tight with impatience. He took a step closer, invading the judge's personal space. "I'm not going to ask you again. Hands on the car!" Judge Hayes knew his rights better than the man standing before him. He knew that a demand like this required, at minimum, reasonable suspicion that he was armed and dangerous. Pumping gas did not meet that threshold. "With all due respect, officer," he began, his tone shifting from that of a citizen to one of a legal expert, "you have no legal basis for this command. I have done nothing wrong. Can you please tell me why I'm being detained?" This assertion of legal knowledge seemed to ignite a fuse in Officer Trent. It was a challenge to his authority, and his response was to double down. "You fit the description of a suspect in a recent string of car thefts in this area," he lied. It was a generic, boilerplate excuse, a flimsy pretext that would later crumble under the slightest scrutiny. No such report existed. "What description is that exactly?" Judge Hayes asked, his gaze steady. He was no longer just a citizen, he was now assessing the situation with the analytical mind of a jurist. He saw an officer acting on a hunch born of something other than evidence. Trent's eyes narrowed. "I don't have to explain myself to you. Now let me see your identification." "I will be happy to provide my identification," Judge Hayes said, making a slow, deliberate move toward his jacket pocket. "But first, I would like for you to identify yourself and provide your badge number." The request was standard procedure, a citizen's right. To Officer Trent, it was another act of defiance. He huffed in exasperation. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be." He gestured impatiently toward the judge's car. "Is this your vehicle?" "Yes, it is," Judge Hayes replied. "It is registered in my name, at my home address, and it is fully insured." "And what do you do for a living that you can afford a car like this?" Trent asked, the question dripping with insinuation. The query was not about a crime. It was about the judge's very presence, his success, his right to exist in this space. The racial undertones were no longer subtle. They were a blaring siren. Judge Hayes had encountered prejudice before, in courtrooms and in life, but rarely this raw, this blatant, from an officer of the law. He maintained his composure, but a cold anger began to smolder within him. "My profession is not relevant to your investigation, officer. You have asked for my identification. I am reaching for it now." He slowly retrieved his wallet from his suit jacket, his movements measured to avoid any perception of a threat. He extracted his driver's license and held it out. As this was happening, a woman in a blue scrubs uniform filling up her minivan 2 pumps over, Sarah Jenkins, a registered nurse on her way home from a 12-hour shift, felt a prickle of alarm. She had seen the officer approach aggressively and heard his raised voice. Her instincts, honed by years in the emergency room, told her this situation was unhealthy and getting worse. She discreetly pulled out her cell phone and hit record, the lens peeking over the top of her vehicle. Officer Trent snatched the license from the judge's hand and glanced at it. He saw the name, Marcus Hayes. He saw the address, a residence in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. He then looked back at the judge, a flicker of something, disbelief, or perhaps annoyance that the facts weren't fitting his narrative, crossing his face. He walked to the rear of the Lincoln, comparing the license plate to the registration details visible through the windshield. They matched perfectly. Any reasonable officer would have concluded the stop at this point. The initial baseless suspicion had been thoroughly debunked. The man was who his license said he was, and he owned the car he was driving. The interaction should have ended with a curt apology and the officer returning to his vehicle. But Officer Trent was not a reasonable officer. He was an officer who had already decided on a narrative of guilt, and he was not about to let the facts get in his way. He walked back to Judge Hayes, the judge's license still in his hand. "This doesn't prove anything," Trent said, his tone still accusatory. "IDs can be faked. Registrations can be forged." He gestured around the affluent area. "We're going to find out what you're really doing here." Judge Hayes was stunned into a moment of silence. The officer wasn't just making a mistake, he was willfully manufacturing a reality to fit his prejudice. The judge realized with a sinking feeling that his knowledge of the law, his position, his years of service to the very system this officer represented meant absolutely nothing. In this moment, on this sun-drenched patch of asphalt, he was not Judge Marcus Hayes. He was just a black man who, in the eyes of this officer, was in the wrong place, driving the wrong car. And that, he was beginning to understand, was a crime for which there was no defense. The conversation had reached a dangerous impasse. Judge Hayes understood that logic and legal precedent were having no effect on Officer Trent. This was no longer an investigation. It was an exercise in harassment. "Officer," he said, his voice low and firm, "you have my identification. You have verified my ownership of this vehicle. There is no legal basis for my continued detention. I would like my license back, and I am going to leave." He took a half step toward the pump to return the nozzle. It was a small, innocuous movement, but to Officer Trent, it was the ultimate act of insubordination. In a motion that was both swift and chillingly deliberate, Trent's right hand dropped from his belt and rested on the checkered grip of his holstered Glock. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You'll leave when I tell you you can leave." The air crackled. The casual sounds of the gas station, the ding of a service bell, the distant hum of traffic seemed to fade into a dull roar in Judge Hayes's ears. His eyes were fixed on the officer's hand. The gesture was unmistakable. It was a threat of lethal force, a clear and unambiguous message that this situation had escalated from a violation of civil rights to a potentially life-or-death encounter. All his years on the bench, all the dangerous criminals he had sentenced, and he had never felt a threat as immediate and personal as this. Judge Hayes froze, raising his hands slowly, palms open. "Officer, there is no need for this," he said, his judicial calm a sheer force of will against the terror clawing at his insides. "You are escalating a routine stop into something extremely serious. I am requesting that you call your supervisor to this scene immediately." This, he thought, would be the circuit breaker. A request for a supervisor was a standard de-escalation tactic. It would bring a more experienced, level-headed officer to the scene who could correct this rookie's dangerous behavior. Officer Trent scoffed, a smirk twisting his lips. "Oh, now you want a supervisor? Because you know you're caught? I don't need a supervisor to deal with you." Desperate to inject some semblance of reality into this surreal nightmare, Judge Hayes decided to play the one card he had held in reserve. "Officer," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his office, I have tried to be cooperative. I am a circuit court judge for this county. My name is Marcus Hayes. A simple radio call to dispatch can verify that. If he had hoped this revelation would shock the officer into compliance, he was gravely mistaken. Officer Trent stared at him for a long moment, then burst out laughing. It was not a sound of mirth. It was a sound of pure, derisive contempt. "A judge? You? That's the best you can come up with?" he sneered. "I've heard it all now. Drug dealers, car thieves, they all got a story. You think that's going to work on me?" The insult was profound. It wasn't just a dismissal of his identity, it was a mockery of his entire life's work. To be treated as a common liar by a man who was sworn to uphold the very laws he adjudicated was a humiliation that cut deeper than any physical threat. "I am not lying," Judge Hayes said, his voice steely despite the tremor of rage he felt. He reached slowly, telegraphing his every move into his inner jacket pocket. "I will provide you with my judicial business card." He pulled out the small, embossed card and held it out. "Judge Marcus Hayes, 12th Judicial Circuit." Trent snatched the card, glanced at it for a fraction of a second, and then flicked it with his thumb. "Anybody can get cards printed at a Kinko's for $10, he said, tossing it onto the passenger seat of the judge's car. "You're going to have to do a lot better than that." Across the way, Sarah Jenkins gasped, her phone camera capturing the entire shocking exchange. The officer's open mockery, his contemptuous dismissal of the judge's credentials, was breathtaking. She knew this was no longer just an aggressive stop. This was a man with a badge and a gun systematically stripping another man of his dignity, his identity, and his rights, all while standing in plain sight. Inside the convenience store, Leo, the young man working the counter, had been watching the interaction with growing unease. He had seen Officer Trent in the station many times before. He'd seen him chat amiably with white customers while grabbing a coffee. He'd seen him ignore teenagers who were genuinely acting suspicious. But his behavior toward the well-dressed black man at Pump 4 was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. It was predatory. Sensing that the situation was spiraling, Leo quietly picked up the phone behind the counter and dialed the police department's non-emergency line. "I'd like to report an officer," he began, his voice low and urgent. "He's harassing a customer at the Shell on Elm Street, and I think something terrible is about to happen." Back at the pump, Officer Trent was not finished. "Since you're being so uncooperative," he said, his eyes glinting with a malicious sort of glee, "I'm going to have to search your vehicle. Open the trunk." The demand was not a request. It was a declaration of total dominance. "Absolutely not," Judge Hayes said, his voice ringing with an authority that had momentarily been shaken, but was now returning, forged in anger and indignation. "You have no warrant, and you have zero probable cause to search my vehicle. You are violating my Fourth Amendment rights, and you know it." He recited the legal standard as if delivering a ruling from the bench, his words precise and cutting. "Oh, a constitutional scholar now, are we?" Officer Trent mocked, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "Innocent people don't have anything to hide. Your refusal to consent just makes me more suspicious. What are you hiding in there? Drugs? Weapons?" Each question was a baseless accusation, designed to provoke and justify his own illegal actions. It was at this moment that a new voice joined the fray. "Excuse me, officer, is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to Mark Peterson, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face, calloused hands, and a flannel shirt tucked into worn jeans. He was a construction foreman who had just finished filling up his Ford F-150 at the adjacent pump. He had been watching the entire interaction, his initial curiosity turning to disbelief and then to outright disgust. He had seen the officer's aggression, the judge's calm demeanor, and the unmistakable signs of a bully with a badge. Officer Trent turned, his expression immediately shifting. The aggressive, snarling demeanor he showed Judge Hayes melted away, replaced by a practiced, professional calm. "Sir, this is an official police investigation," he said to Mark, his tone polite and respectful. For your own safety, I'm going to have to ask you to step back and not interfere. The contrast was staggering, and it was not lost on anyone watching, especially Sarah Jenkins, who made sure her phone was aimed to capture the stark difference in treatment. Mark Peterson was not easily intimidated. He stood his ground, a thumb hooked in his belt loop. "I've been watching this whole thing," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "This gentleman here has been nothing but polite. He's just trying to buy gas. I don't see what kind of investigation you need to conduct." He gestured toward Judge Hayes. "You've been harassing this man for 10 minutes. "Sir, that is your opinion," Trent said, his professional mask beginning to slip as his frustration grew. "You don't know all the facts." "I know what I see," Mark retorted, "and it looks wrong." Seeing an opening, a potential witness who was not being immediately dismissed, Judge Hayes addressed the man directly. "Sir, thank you for your concern. This officer refuses to believe my identity." He pointed to the business card lying on his passenger seat. "Would you mind retrieving that card for me? And perhaps you could call the number on it and verify who I am with the courthouse clerk." Mark Peterson nodded curtly. He walked over to the Lincoln, picked up the card, and looked at it. His eyebrows shot up. He looked from the card to Judge Hayes, and a look of dawning comprehension spread across his face. He'd lived in this county his whole life. He recognized the name. "I'll be damned," he muttered. He pulled out his own rugged-looking smartphone and walked a few paces away, his back to Officer Trent. He dialed the number. The call was answered on the second ring. 12th Judicial Circuit Clerk's Office, how may I help you?" "Yes, hello," Mark said. "My name is Mark Peterson. This is going to sound strange, but I'm at the Shell station on Elm, and there's a gentleman here, a Judge Marcus Hayes, who's having a bit of trouble with a police officer. Can you confirm if he is, in fact, a judge, and if he might be on his way home from the courthouse?" There was a brief pause. Then the clerk's voice returned, tinged with concern. "Yes, sir, Judge Hayes is one of our most respected judges. He presided over a case this morning and left the courthouse about 45 minutes ago. Is everything all right?" "He's fine, but the officer here doesn't seem to believe him," Mark said grimly. "Thank you for your help." He ended the call and walked back toward the confrontation, his expression now one of grim certainty. He stopped directly in front of Officer Trent. "I just got off the phone with the courthouse," he announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "They confirmed it. This man is Judge Marcus Hayes. He left work less than an hour ago. You've got the wrong guy and you're making a colossal mistake." For any rational person, this would have been the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. A third-party verification from the very institution the judge claimed to represent. But Officer Trent's ego was now so deeply invested in the confrontation that backing down felt like a personal defeat he was unwilling to accept. He stared at Mark, his face flushing with anger. "You don't know that was the real courthouse," he snapped, the logic of his argument becoming increasingly surreal. "He could have a friend on standby waiting for a call. You are now interfering with a police investigation. Step back or you will be placed under arrest for obstruction." The threat was hollow, but it was a clear sign that Trent had completely lost control of the situation and his own judgment. He had been challenged, his authority questioned, and his prejudice exposed. Instead of de-escalating, he was threatening to arrest a good Samaritan who had just done his job for him. The situation was no longer just a mistake. It was a runaway train, and Officer Brian Trent was shoveling coal into the engine with both hands. The threat to arrest Mark Peterson was a turning point. It signaled to the small but growing crowd of onlookers that Officer Trent was not operating from a place of reason, but from a place of raw, unchecked authority. The scene at the gas station was transforming. It was no longer a private confrontation between two men. It was becoming a public spectacle. Sarah Jenkins, the nurse, was still recording, her hand steady. Another man, who had been waiting for his car to go through the car wash, had also pulled out his phone and was now live streaming the event to his Facebook page. "You are not going to believe this," he narrated in a hushed, urgent voice. "Cop is harassing a black judge at the Shell on Elm. The guy has ID, had another citizen call the courthouse to verify, and the cop is still threatening him." Within minutes, the live stream had dozens, then hundreds of viewers. The comment section was a torrent of outrage, with people sharing the feed and tagging local news outlets. The digital world was now watching Officer Trent's every move. He seemed oblivious to this, his focus so narrowly fixed on Judge Hayes that he failed to notice the ring of glowing screens encircling him. Judge Hayes felt the shift in the atmosphere. The presence of witnesses, particularly those with cameras, was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided a layer of protection. An officer was less likely to resort to physical violence when he knew he was being recorded from multiple angles. On the other hand, it escalated the public nature of his humiliation. He, a man who guarded his privacy and reputation meticulously, was now the star of a viral video, his character being debated in real time by strangers on the internet. He had to end this. But how? Any move he made could be misinterpreted by the volatile officer. He decided his only viable option was to remain perfectly still, a pillar of calm in the swirling chaos. He stood with his hands visible, his expression neutral, embodying the very judicial temperament that Officer Trent so grotesquely lacked. Frustrated by the interference and the judge's stoicism, Officer Trent made another desperate move. He got on his radio. "Dispatch, this is 3 Adam 15, he said, his voice artificially calm, belying the tense scene. "I need backup at the Shell station, corner of Elm and Oak. I have a potentially uncooperative subject, possible 1055, attracting a crowd and creating a public disturbance." The transmission was a masterclass in distortion. Judge Hayes was the opposite of uncooperative. The crowd had been drawn by Trent's behavior, not the judge's, and the only disturbance was the one Officer Trent himself was orchestrating. Judge Hayes listened to the call and felt a fresh wave of dread. The arrival of more officers, fed Trent's false narrative, could make a dangerous situation catastrophic. They would arrive expecting a hostile subject and an unruly mob, pre-programmed for confrontation. Sarah Jenkins, hearing the call for backup, stepped forward cautiously. "Officer," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I am a registered nurse. This man appears calm and is posing no threat. You are the one creating the disturbance. I have been recording this entire incident, and I can assure you your description of events is not accurate." Trent whirled on her. "Ma'am, I have given you a lawful order to step back. One more word and you're going in cuffs." While Trent was distracted, Leo, the gas station attendant, slipped out of the store. He approached Judge Hayes quietly. "Sir," he whispered, "I called the department as soon as this started. I told the dispatcher one of their officers was out of control. They said they were sending a supervisor directly to the scene. Help is coming." The news was a sliver of hope. A supervisor would, in theory, be an agent of reason. But Judge Hayes knew that everything depended on who arrived first. The supervisor Leo had called for, or the backup Trent had summoned with his false report. As they waited in the suffocating tension, Trent continued his petty harassment. He walked a slow circle around the judge's Lincoln, peering into the windows, as if expecting to find a mountain of contraband sitting on the leather seats. He peppered the judge with questions, each one an accusation. "Where were you really coming from today? Who were you meeting with? Why are you so nervous?" Judge Hayes answered each question with the bare minimum of information, his voice a flat monotone. "From the courthouse. I was at my place of work. I am not nervous. I am being illegally detained." He refused to be baited. He had learned from his years as a prosecutor that in a hostile interrogation, silence and simple facts were an innocent person's best defense. The crowd was now at least 15 people deep. Cars were slowing on the street, their occupants staring at the unfolding drama. The gas station had ceased to function as a business and had become a makeshift theater for a real-life lesson in modern American injustice. Every second that ticked by, every aggressive gesture from Officer Trent, every calm, dignified response from Judge Hayes was being captured, uploaded, and shared, creating an indelible digital record of the officer's disgrace. He was so intent on winning his one-man war against a phantom criminal that he couldn't see the far larger battle for his career and reputation that he was losing so spectacularly with every passing moment. Then, a new set of flashing lights appeared, cutting through the bright afternoon. It wasn't the frenetic strobe of a standard patrol car, it was the measured, alternating pattern of a supervisor's vehicle. A black and white SUV pulled into the lot and parked a respectful distance away. The driver's side door opened, and a woman with silver and black hair pulled into a tight bun stepped out. On her sleeve were the 3 chevrons of a lieutenant. The cavalry had arrived. The question was, whose side was she on? Lieutenant Maria Wallace stepped out of her cruiser and immediately took in the scene with the practiced, all-encompassing gaze of a 25-year veteran. She didn't just see a collection of people, she saw the dynamics of a situation on the verge of collapse. She saw one of her officers, Brian Trent, standing rigid and defensive, his posture radiating aggression. She saw a well-dressed black man standing with a preternatural calm beside a luxury car. And she saw a circle of at least a dozen citizens, all of them with their cell phones out, all of them pointedly recording. Her gut, honed by thousands of similar calls, told her that the official report of an uncooperative subject was likely a severe misrepresentation of the facts. Ignoring Officer Trent completely for the moment, she walked directly toward Judge Hayes. Her approach was professional and disarming. "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Wallace," she said, her voice calm and even. "Can you please tell me what's going on here?" The simple act of being addressed respectfully, as a human being rather than a suspect, was so jarring that Judge Hayes had to take a moment to collect himself. He explained the events of the last 20 minutes, his voice clear and factual, devoid of embellishment or overt anger. He recounted being stopped without cause, the demands, the threats, the refusal to check his identification properly, and the ultimate mockery of his judicial position. He gestured to the witnesses. "These people have seen the entire interaction. I believe several of them have it on video." Lieutenant Wallace listened intently, her expression unreadable but her eyes missing nothing. She nodded slowly when he finished. "Thank you, sir. May I see your driver's license, please?" Judge Hayes handed it to her. Unlike Trent, who had snatched it, Wallace took it respectfully. She didn't question its validity. She turned and walked back toward her vehicle, speaking into the radio clipped to her shoulder. "Dispatch, run a 28 and 29 on a California license," she said, reading off the judge's information. A 28 was a registration check. A 29 was a check for wants and warrants. It was the most basic police procedure, the first thing Trent should have done. While she waited for the return, she finally turned to Officer Trent. "Officer Trent, step over here." Trent strode over, a look of indignant justification on his face. "Lieutenant, this subject was acting suspiciously from the moment I saw him. He refused to follow my commands and became argumentative when I tried to question him." "Argumentative? Or was he asserting his constitutional rights?" Wallace asked, her tone sharp. "What specific articulable facts led you to believe he was involved in criminal activity?" He looked out of place," Trent stammered, the weakness of his own reasoning suddenly exposed under the scrutiny of a superior. "And he took a long time to pump his gas." He was looking around nervously. "I've reviewed the security footage from the convenience store on my way here," Wallace said, a statement that was a calculated bluff, but one that landed with incredible force. "It shows him behaving like any other customer. Now tell me why you felt it was necessary to place your hand on your service weapon." Trent's face went pale. "He was making a move. I thought he might flee." "He was trying to return the nozzle to the pump," Wallace corrected him, her voice like ice. "Did you at any point attempt to verify his identity through dispatch before detaining him for over 20 minutes? "I was about to, but he became uncooperative," Trent insisted, his story already unraveling. Just then, the radio on her shoulder crackled to life. "Dispatch to 4 Lincoln 1. The 28 comes back clear, registered to a Marcus Hayes at 112 Willow Creek Lane. The 29 is clear. Be advised, the subject, Marcus Hayes, is a confirmed sitting judge with the 12th Judicial Circuit Court. No priors, no wants." The dispatcher's voice was flat and professional, but the information it carried was a bomb that detonated the last shreds of Officer Trent's credibility. Lieutenant Wallace's eyes bored into him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her quiet, seething anger was more intimidating than any shout. "You detained a sitting judge for half an hour," she said, each word a hammer blow, "because he looked out of place. You refused to run a simple background check that would have ended this in 90 seconds. You threatened him, you dismissed his credentials, and you did it all in front of a dozen cameras. Do you have any idea the magnitude of the catastrophe you have just created for this department, for this city, and for your own career?" Trent stood there, speechless, the full weight of his actions finally crashing down on him. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by the dawning horror of a man realizing he had made a career-ending, life-altering mistake. Wallace turned her back on him, a gesture of complete dismissal. She walked back to Judge Hayes, handing him back his license. "Judge Hayes," she said, her tone now filled with a deep professional courtesy, "on behalf of the Metropolis Police Department, I want to offer you our most sincere and profound apology. What you experienced here today was unacceptable. It is not in line with our training, our policies, or our values." She then turned to Officer Trent, her voice now hard as steel. "Officer Trent, you will hand your car keys to me. You will get in the back of my vehicle. You are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. We are done here." The apology was offered, and the immediate threat was neutralized. But for Judge Hayes, the damage was already done. The humiliation, the fear, the anger, none of it could be erased by a few polite words. He accepted his license, his hands steady, but his mind was already moving forward. This incident would not end here in a gas station parking lot. It would end in a courtroom. Only this time, he wouldn't be the one on the bench. As Judge Hayes finally prepared to leave, the engine of his Lincoln humming quietly, Officer Trent, now stripped of his authority and waiting by the lieutenant's SUV, made one last, disastrous mistake. As the judge walked past, Trent spoke, his voice a low mutter filled with resentment rather than remorse. "You know, we have a tough job. You of all people should understand that. I was just being cautious." Judge Hayes stopped and turned, his eyes meeting Trent's. The judicial calm he had maintained throughout the ordeal was now gone, replaced by the cold, unwavering gaze of a man delivering a sentence. "Officer, your job is to enforce the law while upholding the Constitution," he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the now silent lot. "What you did today was not caution, it was prejudice. You did not honor your badge, you disgraced it. I pray you learn the difference before you get someone killed." The words, captured clearly by at least 5 cell phone cameras, were devastating. They were not an angry outburst, but a clinical, damning verdict delivered by a man uniquely qualified to give it. It was the final nail in the coffin of Brian Trent's career. That evening, Judge Hayes drove home in a state of controlled fury. He was shaken, not just by the fear he had felt, but by the profound sense of betrayal. He had dedicated his life to a system that, in the span of 30 minutes, had turned on him in the most primitive and ugly way imaginable. He explained what happened to his wife, Sarah, a sharp and resilient woman who was a partner in a downtown accounting firm. Her initial shock quickly turned to a fierce, protective anger. They both knew this could not be swept under the rug. His position gave him a platform, a voice that countless other victims of similar abuse did not have. To remain silent would be a betrayal of every principle he held dear. The next morning, Judge Hayes made a phone call, not to the police chief, not to the mayor, but to Eleanor Vance, a civil rights attorney with a national reputation. Vance was a legal titan, a woman known for her ferocious courtroom presence and her unwavering commitment to holding law enforcement accountable. She had taken on police departments across the country and won. In her glass-walled office overlooking the city, Eleanor Vance watched the collection of cell phone videos that the witnesses had eagerly shared with Judge Hayes. She watched in silence, her expression growing harder with each passing minute. She saw Trent's baseless accusations, his hand on his gun, his derisive laughter, the stark contrast in his treatment of Mark Peterson, and his final self-pitying comment. When the last video ended, she looked across her desk at Judge Hayes. "Judge," she said, her voice devoid of any legal jargon, This is not just a case. This is a gift. The evidence is overwhelming, irrefutable, and frankly, disgusting. They haven't got a leg to stand on. Vance laid out the strategy. They would file a Section 1983 federal civil rights lawsuit for violations of his 4th and 14th Amendment rights. But they wouldn't just sue Officer Trent. They would sue the Metropolis Police Department and the city itself. This wasn't just one bad apple, Judge, she explained. A bad apple is the product of a rotten tree. We're going to prove that the city has a pattern and practice of tolerating this kind of behavior through inadequate training, negligent supervision, and a broken internal affairs system. Over the next few weeks, Vance's legal team went to work with surgical precision. They subpoenaed Officer Trent's personnel file. What they found was a disturbing yet predictable pattern. In his 6 years on the force, Trent had accumulated more than a dozen citizen complaints, 8 of them alleging racial bias and excessive force. All had been dismissed with a simple unfounded or resulted in a minor slap-on-the-wrist reprimand. He had a documented history of pulling over minority drivers at a rate 3 times higher than his peers, with a search rate that was 5 times higher, despite his contraband hit rate being significantly lower. The data painted a clear picture of a biased officer who had been allowed to operate with impunity for years. The team also deposed other officers, some of whom, under the protection of a subpoena, reluctantly admitted that Trent was known as a cowboy who was always looking for a fight and held old-school views. They discovered that the department's implicit bias and de-escalation training consisted of a 4-hour video seminar that officers were required to watch once every 2 years. It was a check-the-box exercise, not a meaningful attempt at reform. 3 weeks after the gas station incident, Eleanor Vance held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. With Judge Hayes standing silently and stoically by her side, she announced the filing of a $20 million lawsuit against Officer Brian Trent and the city of Metropolis. "This is not about money," Vance declared, her voice booming over the clicks of dozens of cameras. "This is about accountability. It is about sending a message that will echo in every police department in this nation, that the Constitution is not a suggestion. It is the law. And when you violate the rights of a citizen, any citizen, whether he is a janitor or a judge, there will be a reckoning. Officer Trent's actions were a disgrace, but the true failure belongs to the department that trained, supervised, and repeatedly failed to discipline him. We will prove that what happened to Judge Hayes was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of a broken system." The news exploded, becoming the lead story on every national network. The $20 million figure was designed to shock, to grab headlines, and to signal that they would not be satisfied with a quiet nuisance value settlement. The battle lines were drawn. A judge, who had spent his life interpreting the law, was now a plaintiff, using that same law to seek justice for himself and to force a powerful institution to confront its own deep-seated failures. The lawsuit landed like a bombshell in the city's political landscape. The police chief, a man who had built his career on a tough-on-crime image, initially offered a defensive, non-committal statement about an ongoing internal investigation. But that posture became untenable as the videos of the incident played on a continuous loop on national television. The footage was simply too damning, Officer Trent's conduct too egregious to be explained away. Public pressure mounted with ferocious speed. Civil rights groups organized protests outside police headquarters, and the NAACP demanded Trent's immediate firing and a federal investigation into the department's practices. The city council was inundated with angry calls from citizens. The mayor, facing a tough re-election campaign, saw a crisis that could sink his political career. The city's attorneys knew they were in an impossible position. Eleanor Vance had presented them with a case backed by incontrovertible video evidence, multiple credible witnesses, and a plaintiff who was one of the most respected figures in the city's legal community. Within 48 hours of the lawsuit being filed, The internal affairs investigation, which had been proceeding at a snail's pace, suddenly concluded. Their findings were stark. Officer Brian Trent had violated no fewer than 7 departmental policies, including unlawful detention, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and immense political pressure, the police chief held a press conference. He announced that Brian Trent's employment with the Metropolis Police Department had been terminated, effective immediately. Trent, through his police union-appointed lawyer, vowed to fight his termination, claiming he was a scapegoat for a politically motivated witch hunt. But his defense rang hollow. Even his fellow officers, who might normally close ranks, were privately distancing themselves. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had humiliated the entire department on a national stage. The termination was a victory, but for Judge Hayes and Eleanor Vance, it was only the beginning. The lawsuit was about more than one officer. It was about the system that created him. The city, hoping to stanch the bleeding, offered a quick settlement in the low 7 figures. Vance laughed and rejected it out of hand. "We are not going away until we have real, structural change," she told the city's lead attorney. As the legal process of discovery continued, Vance's team unearthed more evidence of systemic rot. The case was no longer just about Judge Hayes. It was about the countless other nameless citizens who had been subjected to Trent's biased policing over the years. The pressure on the city became unbearable. The cost of a public trial, where Judge Hayes would testify and the videos would be played for a jury, was a risk they could not afford to take, not just financially, but politically. 6 months after that bright Wednesday afternoon at the gas station, the city capitulated. They agreed to a settlement. The final figure was $12.5 million, one of the largest in the city's history for a police misconduct case. But the money was only part of the victory. Vance, with Judge Hayes's full backing, had insisted on a comprehensive consent decree, a court-enforced agreement that mandated sweeping reforms. The decree required a complete overhaul of the police department's training on use of force, de-escalation, and implicit bias. It mandated the immediate adoption of a policy requiring all officers to have body cameras turned on for every public interaction. It established a new independent civilian oversight board with the power to investigate and recommend discipline for misconduct. And it required the department to implement an early warning system to flag officers like Trent, who accumulated numerous complaints, for mandatory retraining and supervision. The settlement was a landmark victory. Judge Hayes chose to donate a significant portion of his settlement to fund a new public interest law fellowship at his alma mater, dedicated to police accountability and civil rights litigation. His personal trauma had been forged into a tool for systemic change. He had faced the ugly face of injustice not in his robed and protected role on the bench, but as a vulnerable citizen at a gas pump. He had been terrified and humiliated, but he had survived. And he had used his unique position to fight back not just for himself, but for all the people who could not. Officer Brian Trent, the young officer so certain of his own authority, ended his career in disgrace, a cautionary tale taught in police academies. His name became synonymous with the high cost of unchecked prejudice. The simple act of buying gas had set in motion a chain of events that forced a city to confront its demons and, however reluctantly, begin the long, arduous process of reform. What drove Officer Trent to such a catastrophic failure of judgment? At its core, his actions likely stemmed from a toxic cocktail of implicit bias, insecurity, and a profound lack of proper training. He saw a black man with the trappings of success in a place he subconsciously felt the man didn't belong, and his mind filled in the rest with a narrative of criminality. This initial biased assumption once made was something his ego could not allow him to retract. Every assertion of rights by Judge Hayes was not seen as a citizen's legal prerogative, but as a personal challenge to his authority. He fell into a psychological trap known as escalation of commitment. He had invested so much of his authority in the initial, flawed stop that he felt he had to keep doubling down, becoming more aggressive and irrational to justify his first mistake. Proper de-escalation training would have taught him to disengage, to recognize when a situation is based on a faulty premise and step back. Instead, his training, or lack thereof, had clearly reinforced a warrior mindset over that of a guardian. Could Judge Hayes have done anything differently? It's a difficult, almost unfair question to ask of a victim. If he had been more submissive, perhaps the encounter would have ended sooner, but at the cost of his dignity and the validation of the officer's illegal behavior. If he had been more aggressive, the situation could have easily turned deadly, with his resistance being used as a post-mortem justification. His chosen path, unwavering calm, firm assertion of his rights, and reliance on his knowledge of the law, was likely the optimal strategy under horrific circumstances. The lesson here is that when confronted with irrationality backed by force, the best defenses are witnesses and evidence. The presence of citizens with cameras, particularly proactive allies like Mark Peterson and Leo, was arguably just as crucial as the judge's own composure. They created a shield of accountability that protected him when his own status could not. The ultimate lesson of this story is both chilling and empowering. It shows that injustice and prejudice can target anyone, anywhere, regardless of their accomplishments or position in society. A robe and a gavel are no shield against the barrel of a gun guided by bias. But it also shows the immense power of civilian oversight and the courage of ordinary people. The cameras in their hands became instruments of justice. Their willingness to speak up, to make a phone call, to bear witness, transformed a personal humiliation into a public cause. This story is a powerful reminder that the responsibility for justice does not lie solely with judges and lawyers in a courthouse. It lies with every single one of us in the gas stations and on the sidewalks of our communities. We are all the guardians of our collective civil rights. What do you think of the final settlement? Was $12.5 million and the mandated reforms enough to truly bring about change? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it so that more people can see that while the fight for justice is often long and difficult, it is a fight that together we can win.